Good afternoon, Ms. Boyd. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule at St Mary's here in Darwin. I've got a few questions that I've got to ask you, if that's all right.
No problem.
Can you tell me about how you use data to inform decisions for planning and teaching a teaching cycle?
I'll talk about how I personally do it and then how we do it as a school. So I suppose we have an assessment schedule which is fixed throughout the school and includes all of our learning areas. And so for each unit that we're teaching, we collect pre, mid and post data, and that usually it takes various forms actually. We use that data to put faces to who needs what, where children are at and teaching at their point of need. We know that if we pitch to the middle of the group, we're missing students on either end, and that's just not a particularly effective way of teaching. And so we use assessment data, both formative and summative, to inform the way that we plan. And then also to assess what students have caught and what we need to revisit.
Yeah, so that pre-assessment, that's like diagnostic assessment on how the kids are, where they're placed sort of in terms of what the unit content is for that term?
If they haven't encountered that content before, yes. Usually though, we've got, in something like maths that's cumulative, we've got data from their previous learning unit. I had a thought but I lost it.
And as a classroom teacher, how do you know where you fit into that school's assessment plan? You were saying as a school you sort of have this large scale assessment plan.
Yeah.
Who writes the schedule?
Some of it's dictated to us from Catholic Education Northern Territory, and then we make school-based decisions based on our learners. So currently our learners are lower than the national average for maths, and so we've put measures in place over the last 9 months to improve that data. Can you ask me the question again?
No, I guess the only question I'm sort of sitting with is, we talked about assessment. How do you provide feedback to students?
Sure.
And what does effective feedback look like?
Effective feedback looks like intentional feedback based on the success criteria. Mm-hmm. So this is what you're currently doing. If you did this, you know, it would elevate your knowledge and skills, so that you'd be demonstrating that you were sitting here. I think things like with every classroom we have a bump it up wall, and sometimes that bump it up wall becomes more than that because students start to plot themselves, and so it starts to become more of a knowledge wall for them, I suppose. But they get targeted feedback from that around where they're currently sitting and what they need to do to move next. I think for teachers, it's about that feedback being really timely, really often, and probably knowing your students. So if you've got a demographic of students in your class that feel really embarrassed by that sort of feedback, whether it's constructive and pushing students to the next level, or even positive, some students are quite embarrassed by being publicly acknowledged like that, the teacher needs to understand who the people are in the classroom and what works for them. But it needs to be really targeted feedback around the learning and what's being done really well and how to improve.
As a teacher, how do you plan lessons to try and incorporate engaging teaching strategies?
So I teach the early years mostly, and what I know as an early years teacher of a few decades is that students, little people, learn better through doing. And so processes that are collaborative, that allow them to investigate and discover, are what I usually try to use. And then I'm really conscious of ensuring that students are acquiring skills and knowledge in ways that allow them to engage in higher order thinking, like complex sort of thinking, and that so that things are more give them an opportunity to engage in processes where they are able to evaluate and analyse and make decisions about their own learning. I think it's really important that they understand what they're learning and can articulate that.
And how do you, when you're doing your planning, in terms of planning those lessons that provide those opportunities, how do you try and differentiate the different levels of sort of student ability?
Well, we use data, but also we've got obviously some really clearly identified students who have, you know, students with disability.
Yep.
We've also got a really high percentage of students who have English as an additional language, and so they require quite a lot of work at the front end of the teaching cycle for a unit of work that's unknown to them around unpacking vocab and that sort of thing. I feel like I haven't answered the question. What was it?
No, I think that's a really good, that was a good answer to the question that I'd asked. And I think actually leads on to how you teach general capabilities, because I think that as a secondary science teacher, often the way we look at general capabilities, like literacy, is about, you know, subject-specific literacy and how we plan for that sort of general capability. And it sounds like that's something you're having to do because of your EALD, your English as an additional language or dialect students. Are there other ways that you plan to teach the general capabilities, and also particularly how you incorporate the cross-curricular priorities when you're planning your teaching cycle?
I think they are embedded in our unit planners, and so and we've got a scope and sequence as a school, a 2-year biennial scope and sequence, because we teach in stages at this school. So year 1, 2 has got a 2-year cycle.
Which brings us really neatly onto the next question of how you as a teacher make judgments on the quality of student work, and how do you engage in moderation practices? Okay,
so I think within our unit of work, the success criteria there comes straight from the curriculum, the learning achievement standard in the curriculum. And so when we unpack the success criteria with students around what they will do to demonstrate that they've picked up those skills and that knowledge, that kind of forms like our rubric of what we're looking for. All students need to be able to demonstrate the learning intention, and that's an equity issue. So we make sure that all of the students can demonstrate what we're the learning intention, but then the success criteria, the depth and breadth of how well students demonstrate that determines how well they do or don't do. And because that is quite subjective, we do moderate around that. We moderate around that in teams, but once a term we moderate around that as an entire staff.
Can you explain to me how that moderation as an entire staff works?
Yeah. So we move out of our teams and we move into a linear group. Everybody brings samples of work and
from the whole classroom, or like
no.
sort of you evaluate your class and say, I'm going to bring a low performer, a high performer, and a
mid.
middle.
Yep, absolutely, that's what we do. So someone who is achieving below, at and above the expected level, we bring that with our annotations and justifications. We don't speak to that at all. Our teachers take it in turns to share their samples, and we look at what they were looking for, obviously, and then we talk to it as a group, and then the teacher, discusses their beliefs around how they reached their judgment.
Do teachers often then go back and re-evaluate the sort of the way they have assessed quality on those? So they take those samples and go back and say, actually, I've been thinking these students are high performers, but they're really middle of the range, or vice versa. Is that something that teachers will then go back and implement in their own practice, or how does that work?
Yeah, every time. I think it's doing that. We've only been doing that since term 4 last year. That's changed the way that we operate in terms of the way that we assess students, and that I think has a lot to do with that subjectivity and the fact that, an example would be that a child doesn't always demonstrate what they're capable of, and a teacher sees them as a bit chaotic and maybe quite brilliant academically, but we've got one teacher who says, well, they didn't really demonstrate that to me, and for us to be able to let the child know, this is where I need you to really show me what you can do, then sit with the rest of the staff and unpick that in terms of, well, they did do that, they did it here, here and here. If we bring our prejudice, I guess, around our students to the way that we mark their work and assess their ability, I think it's really good to have other people's eyes on that regularly.
I think that obviously, like, that's one of the driving forces behind moderation, because there are lots of little personalities in a classroom sometimes, and if you don't have that excellent moderation, it's easy to let that personality cloud your perception of how that student's travelling.
For sure. And so then that becomes important for us, because across class groupings, we need to ensure that we are marking in a really consistent way, and that our judgment as a staff, but particularly as a team group, is aligned.
And how do you, so this is how you sort of evaluate how a student's doing. How do you measure the impact of your teaching on a student's learning? So rather than just seeing how a student's travelling, like how do you measure your impact on their learning?
So we meet twice a week, and the beginning of each staff meeting on the second meeting is a data session where we sit with a data set and we use something like a Venn diagram, and we plot our students on that. So we might do it for, say, our Year 3 students for NAPLAN, for example, mathematical achievement in NAPLAN. Then what we generally do is, ask me the question again, sorry?
Like how do you as a teacher measure the impact that you're having on a student's learning?
Okay, so NAPLAN's not a good example, it's too broad. I think we do that with the data around whatever we're teaching at the time or have just taught. And so when we end up with, it's really good when we end up with pockets of students who are just below expected level in something, and this is happening for us with maths a lot at the moment, but regularly that happens in just one class. And so then the teacher can make their own, I guess they can come to their own conclusions about what's happening there. What we then do is we will spotlight those students who are really close to being, at expected level, for example. The students who need just a little bit more of something, might have all the pieces but haven't worked out how to put that all together in a really, it's not secure for them. And so then we will bring one of those students to a case management meeting, which I'm always at, and depending on the student's needs, the inclusion coordinator might be at, and the classroom teacher's always at, and they bring samples of the student's work. That is, we talk about where the student's at, and then our sole focus of that meeting, it's a short meeting, it's only for 15 minutes, is what the teacher can do next for the next 3 weeks to move that child. So it's around...
but the focus being on how the teacher is teaching, or what the teacher...
The focus is on instructional strategies and ones that are going to have a big impact.
Yeah.
And so, and it's often, the teacher will often say, I know that, I don't know why I'm not doing that. But having 3 bodies in the room and being able to bounce that around and having other people there, knowledgeable others, I suppose, just helps bring some of those things onto their radar.
And do teachers get much feedback from students about their sort of how students are feeling about the work they understand? Like, is that something you gather?
I think this is something that we're working on a lot at the moment. We go as a leadership team into classrooms and ask students a set 5 questions twice a week, and we go into every room and do that. Those questions we use to ascertain whether or not students are driving their own learning, if they understand what they're learning, where to go to for help, who their people are in the room, I suppose.
Thank you very much, Ms. Boyd. I really appreciate you taking the time. I think it's really helped to highlight to me that things in undertaking the GPPA, that the interlinkages between these areas of practice, and that you don't develop one area of practice in isolation, that these things all flow into each other and are really important to do, particularly as a whole school when you're able to take advantage of those opportunities.
Yeah.
But yeah, thanks again for taking your time. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.